The dust of Harmony Gulch tasted of endings. It settled on everything: the sweat-stained hats of dead men, the splintered wood of the bank teller's cage, and the silent, gaping mouths of the townsfolk huddled against the storefronts. Inside the First Colorado Bank, the air thick with the metallic tang of gunpowder and fear was unnaturally still. Jack Cole lay pressed against the floor at the rough-hewn planks digging into his cheek. He was just a ranch hand here to deposit the meager earnings from a cattle sale. That was all he was supposed to be. But the instincts of a past life died hard. He tracked the movements of the robbers, 4 of them, their faces masked by dusty bandanas. Their leader, however, wore no mask. He stood by the vault, his tall frame clad in a tailored black coat that seemed to absorb the frantic noon light pouring through the shattered windows. His name, he had announced with the calm articulation of a professor, was Silas Kane. "Mr. Abernathy Kane," said his voice, a low, cultured murmur that cut through the whimpers of the hostages. He addressed the bank manager, a portly man whose face was a slick mask of terror. "You have been most cooperative. But cooperation, like currency, has its limits." Kane's pistol rose, not with a sudden jerk, but with the fluid grace of a conductor's baton. The shot was an ear-splitting crack, a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence no one had wanted to hear. Abernathy collapsed behind the counter, a neat, dark hole blooming on his starched white shirt. A woman screamed a raw, ragged sound that was quickly stifled. It was the coldness of the act that chilled Jack more than the violence itself. It wasn't robbery. It was an execution. A message. As Kane's men began hauling canvas bags, heavy with coin and paper, one of them kicked at Jack a brutish gesture of dominance. "This one ain't moved a muscle." "Dead already," the man grunted. The impact jarred something loose from Jack's shirt pocket. A small silver locket skittered across the floor, coming to rest near the toe of Silas Kane's polished boot. It spun, flashing in the dusty light, before lying still. Kane's gaze fell upon it. He bent down, his movements unhurried, and picked it up between his thumb and forefinger. Jack's blood ran cold. He didn't care about the money, the town, or the dead man. He cared only for that locket. Kane clicked it open. Inside, the tiny, faded portraits of a woman and a little girl stared back, a ghost of a smile on the woman's lips, a mischievous glint in the child's eyes. Sarah and Lily. His Sarah. His Lily. The memory hit Jack with the force of a physical blow, a phantom pain that was worse than any bullet. A blizzard-swept night outside of Laramie. The scent of pine and burning wood. The warmth of his cabin, a fortress against the howling wind. He'd been a U.S. Marshal then, a man who believed in the simple arithmetic of justice. He'd brought in the Walton gang, leaving their wounded leader, a young man named Elias, chained in the town jail. He had returned home triumphant, only to find his world reduced to ash and screams. The remaining gang members, led by Elias's older brother, had sought their own brand of justice. They hadn't wanted him. They had wanted to take what he loved. The fire. The sight of Sarah's hand, reaching from the flames. Lily's favorite doll lying blackened in the snow. He had found the locket in the ashes, warped by the heat, but still closed, protecting the images within. It was all he had left. He had resigned his commission the next day, trading his badge for a quiet life of punishing labor, a self-imposed penance in the shadow of the mountains. A sentimental man, Kane mused, his voice drawing Jack back to the present. He held the locket up. A family man, or perhaps a man who was. He looked directly at Jack, and for a fleeting second, his cool gray eyes held a flicker of something that looked unnervingly like recognition. Or was it contempt, and then with a flick of his wrist, he tossed the locket back onto the floor beside Jack's head. "Keep your ghosts," Kane said softly. "The living have more pressing concerns." He turned and strode out of the bank, his men following like loyal wolves. Their hoofbeats faded down the main street, leaving behind a silence broken only by the sound of weeping. Jack didn't move. He lay with his face against the floor, the grit of dust and blood on his lips, his gaze fixed on the small silver oval that held the entire universe he had lost. The past he had buried so deep was no longer buried. It had been unearthed by a killer's touch, and Jack knew with a certainty that settled like ice in his bones that this was not just a robbery. It was a beginning. Weeks bled into a month, and the memory of the bank robbery settled over Harmony Gulch like a low-grade fever, a persistent, uneasy heat that no one could shake. Jack Cole retreated further into his solitude. His ranch was a small, hard-scrabbled patch of earth tucked into a fold of the foothills, a place where the wind was the only constant companion. The days were a ritual of mindless labor, mending fences, tending to his small herd of cattle, chopping wood, until his muscles screamed and his mind was too numb for memories. But the nights were long, and in the quiet of his small cabin, the faces in the locket would return their silent smiles and accusation. He avoided the town whenever possible. He'd seen the way the townsfolk looked at him now, the man who had lain still while their bank manager was murdered. They didn't know the coiled stillness of a predator waiting for the right moment. They saw only cowardice. He let them. His past was a locked room, and he had no intention of handing anyone the key. His nearest neighbor, nearly a mile down the winding dirt track, was a woman named Grace Holloway. He knew of her mostly through whispers on his rare trips for supplies. She ran a small boarding house, a converted barn on a plot of land that was more rock than soil, and she had a young child. The whispers said she was a widow, that she'd come from the south looking for a fresh start. Jack saw her sometimes from a distance, a slender figure hanging laundry that whipped in the mountain breeze, her movements efficient and weary. She kept to herself as much as he did, and he respected the invisible boundary between their worlds. That boundary dissolved on a blistering afternoon in late summer. Jack was repairing a trough near the edge of his property when he heard the frantic cry of a child, sharp and terrified, followed by the low guttural bellow of an agitated bull. He dropped his hammer and ran vaulting the fence that separated his land from hers. He found them in the small pasture behind her barn. Grace was struggling to pull her toddler, a little girl with a mop of sun-bleached curls, from a thicket of thorns she'd wandered into. Not 20 yards away, her bull, a massive, ill-tempered creature with horns like scythes, was pawing at the dry earth, its eyes red with fury. The child's cries were agitating it further, winding it tighter and tighter. Grace's face was pale, her voice a strained whisper as she tried to soothe her daughter. "It's all right, Lily, Mama's here." "Hush now." But her hands trembled as she worked at the thorns, and she kept glancing over her shoulder at the looming threat. Jack didn't shout. He didn't want to startle the bull into a charge. He moved in a low crouch, circling wide. His mind, the part of him that had once been Marshall Cole, took over. It assessed angles, calculated risks, saw the world not as a rancher, but as a battlefield. He picked up a fist-sized rock. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and even. "Keep pulling her out. Don't look at him. Just get the child and walk slowly back to the barn." Grace flinched at the sound of his voice, her head snapping around. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were wide with a fear that seemed older and deeper than the immediate danger. He saw the faint, yellowing bruise high on her cheekbone, a ghost of a hurt that had nothing to do with bulls or thorns. She looked at him for a moment, her gaze searching, hesitant, before she nodded and turned back to her daughter. The bull snorted, a hot plume of dust erupting from its nostrils. It lowered its head. It was going to charge. Jack didn't wait. He hurled the rock with practiced deadly accuracy. It struck the bull squarely on its flank, a sharp, surprising sting. The animal bellowed in outrage, its head whipping around to face the new threat. That was all the diversion Jack needed. Now he commanded. Grace finally freed her daughter from the thorns. She scooped the crying child into her arms and without a backward glance moved with a stumbling urgency toward the safety of the barn. The bull forgot the woman and child. Its entire world narrowed to the man who had dared to strike it. It charged. Jack stood his ground. The thundering hooves shook the very earth beneath his feet. The world became a blur of dust and horns and raw charging muscle. For a man who had faced down armed outlaws, it was a strangely clarifying moment. At the last possible second, he sidestepped his body, moving with an agility that belied his rancher's frame. The bull thundered past, unable to stop its own momentum. As it went by, Jack grabbed a fistful of the coarse hair on its back, vaulted onto its powerful shoulders, and drove the heel of his boot hard behind its ear. The blow was stunning, not damaging. The bull staggered, shaking its massive head in confusion. It stumbled to a halt, the fight knocked out of it. It looked back at Jack, who had already dropped to the ground, its red-rimmed eyes now more bewildered than angry. It gave a low, rumbling grunt and trotted away to the far end of the pasture, defeated. Jack stood, breathing heavily, the adrenaline slowly ebbing from his veins. He turned toward the barn. Grace was standing in the doorway, clutching her daughter, who had quieted to a series of hiccuping sobs. Grace's eyes were fixed on him, her expression a mixture of shock, relief, and something else he couldn't quite name. It looked like suspicion. He walked toward her, dusting off his hands on his trousers. He stopped a respectful distance away. "You all right?" he asked, his voice returning to its usual terse quiet. She nodded, her throat working. "We are. Thank you. I've never seen anyone do that." "He's more bluff than bite," Jack said, though they both knew it was a lie. He looked at the little girl who was now peeking at him from over her mother's shoulder, her thumb stuck firmly in her mouth. "What's her name?" Lily. Grace whispered the word, barely audible. The name was a punch to the gut. Jack's expression didn't change, but inside the floor gave way. "Lily." He forced himself to nod, the motion stiff. "You should get a better latch for that pasture gate." He said, his tone gruff to cover the sudden rawness he felt. He turned to leave his duty done, the wall of his solitude ready to be rebuilt. "Wait," Grace called out. Her voice was stronger now. "Who are you?" Jack paused, his back to her. He was just a rancher, a man with no name worth knowing. "Jack Cole," he said without turning around. "I live over the ridge." He walked away, leaving her standing in the shadow of the barn and the weight of her stare on his back. He didn't look back, but he could feel it, the first crack in the foundation of the quiet, empty life he had so carefully constructed. And it had been broken by the sound of a name he thought he would never hear spoken with love again. The arrival of Silas Kane and his associates was as quiet and deliberate as his bank robbery had been brutally loud. They didn't ride into Harmony Gulch with guns drawn. They arrived on the afternoon stagecoach, dressed in fine Eastern suits, carrying leather briefcases. Kane, looking more like a land speculator than an outlaw, purchased the old Miller Ranch, a sprawling property that bordered both Jack's and Grace's land, for a price in cash that stunned the county clerk. He introduced himself to the town council as a cattle baron from Chicago, looking to establish a new hub for his operations. He was charming, articulate, and generous, buying a round of drinks for everyone in the saloon and making a sizable donation to the church roof fund. The town, still reeling from the robbery, was hungry for good news and prosperity. They embraced him. Jack watched from a distance. He recognized two of the men with Kane from the bank. They had traded their dusty trail clothes for store-bought finery, but their eyes were the same, hard, predatory, and watchful. When Kane smiled, his eyes remained as cold and empty as a winter sky. Jack knew with chilling certainty that this was no cattle operation. This was an occupation. Cain's influence spread insidiously. He began buying up debt from local ranchers, offering generous terms that were too good to refuse. He spoke of partnership, of building a stronger community together. But Jack saw the strategy for what it was: a slow, methodical strangulation. The pressure on Grace Holloway began subtly. A representative of Cain's newly formed Consolidated Cattle Company paid her a visit, offering to buy her small rocky plot. The offer was generous, far more than the land was worth. Grace, Jack learned from the town's ever-present gossip mill, politely refused. She had just gotten the boarding house turning a small profit. This was her home, the only one she and Lily had. A week later, the creek that supplied her water suddenly ran muddy and foul. An investigation revealed that a dead cow belonging to Cain's ranch was bloating upstream. It was an accident, Cain's foreman explained with profuse apologies. A terrible, unfortunate accident. Then a small fire broke out in her hay shed. It was extinguished before it could spread to the main barn, but it destroyed her winter feed. Again, Cain's men were the first on the scene, helping to put it out, their faces etched with concern. They suggested it might have been a stray spark from a passing train, though the tracks were over 2 miles away. Jack saw the pattern. These weren't accidents. They were warnings. He found himself watching her property from the ridgeline of his own, his old marshal's instincts screaming that something was deeply wrong. He saw the weariness in Grace's shoulders deepen the fearful way she now scanned the horizon before letting Lily play outside. The final straw came in the form of a stampede. Jack was mending a fence when he heard the low rumble, a sound like distant thunder that grew steadily louder. He scrambled to the highest point of his property and saw it 100 head of Cain's prime cattle driven into a frenzy, charging directly toward Grace's unfenced pasture, where she and Lily were tending a small vegetable garden. He didn't think. He ran. The fence between their properties was a blur of splintered wood as he cleared it. He could hear Grace screaming Lily's name, a sound of pure panic. The ground trembled beneath his feet. He reached them just as the first of the maddened animals crashed through the flimsy garden fence. "Get in the root cellar," Jack yelled, shoving Grace toward the small wooden door set into the ground near the barn. "Milnes." He didn't wait to see if she obeyed. He turned to face the tide of horns and hooves. He pulled his revolver, the old Colt he hadn't worn in years, but had started carrying again after Cain's arrival. He didn't aim at the animals. He fired into the air, 1, 2, 3 shots, the blasts echoing across the valley. The lead steers, startled by the sudden sharp explosions, so close, veered away from the noise. The herd, a creature of singular panicked instinct, followed its leaders. The river of beef and muscle split, flowing around the small island of the barn and garden, thundering off into the open plains beyond. In the ensuing quiet, the air was thick with dust and the smell of terrified animals. Jack stood, his gun still smoking, his chest heaving. The door to the root cellar creaked open. Grace emerged, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes wide and haunted. Lily was clinging to her leg, crying silently. Grace stared at him, at the gun in his hand, at the calm authority in his stance. This was not the act of a simple rancher. This was something else entirely. "They were driven," she said, her voice shaking. "I saw a rider on the ridge. He fired his rifle to spook them." Jack nodded, his jaw tight. He already knew. He holstered his pistol. "They want your land, ma'am." "Why?" she cried, a note of desperation in her voice. "It's nothing. It's worthless rock." "It's not about the land," Jack said, his gaze distant, looking past her toward the sprawling, manicured perfection of Cain's ranch. "It's about you. He's trying to break you, isolate you." Grace looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time. The fear in her eyes was slowly being replaced by a dawning understanding. You knew this was coming. It wasn't a question. I had my suspicions, Jack admitted. He looked down at his hands, then back at her. The wall between them had been irrevocably breached. He was no longer just a neighbor. He was a participant. You and the girl, he said, his voice dropping to a low, serious tone. You're not safe here alone anymore. He had spent years running from connection, from responsibility, from anything that resembled the life he had lost. But looking at this woman and her child, standing scared and defiant in the ruins of their garden, he knew the running was over. He had saved them from a stampede, but in doing so he had placed himself directly in the path of a much more dangerous predator. He had made a vow to protect them not with words, but with an action he could not take back. And in the cold, calculating eyes of Silas Kane that made him an enemy. A tentative alliance formed in the quiet aftermath of the stampede, forged not in words, but in shared purpose. Jack helped Grace rebuild her garden fence, his movements economical and sure. She brought him cool water from her well, her own hands, though trembling slightly, never spilling a drop. They worked in a comfortable silence, and the unspoken danger hanging in the air between them, like the afternoon heat. He offered to buy my debt at the general store, Grace said one afternoon, breaking the quiet. She was watching Lily chase a butterfly near the barn door. Mr. Kane. He was so polite. He said he wanted to help me get back on my feet. His kind of help always comes at a price, Jack replied, not looking up from the post he was setting. I know, she said softly. My late husband. He was a man who always offered help, and he always collected. The shadow that crossed her face told Jack everything he needed to know about her past. The bruise on her cheek from the day he'd first met her suddenly made a painful kind of sense. She was a woman who had spent a lifetime learning to recognize predators. That evening, Jack didn't go back to his own cabin. He took a bedroll into her barn, insisting he'd be more comfortable there, closer to the stock. It was a lie. He was positioning himself as a guardian, a silent sentinel between her and the growing threat over the ridge. Grace didn't argue. She simply left a lantern burning low by the barn door, a small beacon in the oppressive dark. As days turned into weeks, their shared existence found a quiet rhythm. Jack began to investigate Silas Kane with the methodical patience of his former profession. He rode the perimeter of Kane's property, noting the number of armed guards, far too many for a simple cattle operation. He spoke to disgruntled hands in town, gleaning small, seemingly insignificant details. Kane paid in gold coin, never paper. He received mail postmarked from St. Louis, but never sent any out. He had a fondness for classical music, a phonograph, playing softly from his ranch house late at night. One night, as he shared a simple meal of beans and bread with Grace at her small kitchen table, she spoke of her past. She told him about her husband, a charming gambler, who had died in a card game, gone wrong, leaving her with nothing but debts and the child she carried. She spoke of her dream to be a singer, a life that had ended in a smoky saloon, where a woman's voice was just another commodity to be bought and sold. I came here to be invisible. She confessed, her gaze fixed on the flickering candle flame. I just wanted a place where no one knew my name, where Lily could grow up without shadows. Jack listened, his own ghosts stirring in the quiet of the room. He found himself telling her about his ranch, the soil, the way the light hit the mountains at dawn. He spoke of superficial things, but it was more than he had shared with anyone in years. He didn't tell her about Sarah or his Lily. The names were still too sharp, too sacred to be spoken aloud. But he felt the weight of them lessen just slightly in her presence. Their bond deepened, built on the foundation of shared trauma, and a mutual unspoken understanding of loss. He saw the way her hands no longer trembled when she handed him a cup of coffee. He heard her humming a soft lullaby to Lily, her voice hesitant at first, then growing stronger, clearer. For his part, he found himself smiling a foreign, rusty feeling. He carved a small wooden horse for Lily, its edges sanded smooth, and the look of pure joy on the child's face was a balm to a wound he thought would never heal. He was beginning to care, and that terrified him. The first real clue came from an old sheepherder Jack found camped out in the high country. The old man had seen one of Cain's men riding near an old abandoned mine shaft. The man was carrying a spade. Driven by a hunch, Jack went to investigate. Under the cover of darkness, he found the place. The earth was freshly disturbed. He dug. He didn't find a body. He found a small, rotted crate. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were bundles of banknotes. He recognized the wrappers from the First Colorado Bank. Cain wasn't a cattle baron. He was laundering the money from the robbery, using the ranch as a front, slowly buying up the entire valley with its own stolen wealth. But it still didn't make sense. The risk was too great for the reward. The violence of the robbery, the murder of the bank manager, the systematic torment of Grace, it was all too personal. This wasn't about greed. It was about something else. The answer arrived on a moonless night. Jack was making his final rounds, checking the perimeter of Grace's property, when a figure stepped out of the shadows of the cottonwood trees. It was Silas Cain, alone and unarmed. Or at least he appeared to be. "A beautiful night, Mr. Cole Cain," said his voice, calm and conversational, the kind of night that encourages reflection. Jack's hand went to the Colt at his hip. "What do you want, Cain?" "Direct." "I appreciate that," Cain said with a thin smile. He took a step closer into the faint moonlight. "I've been watching you. The way you mend a fence. The way you watch over the woman and her child. You build things. You protect things. It's a commendable quality." He paused. "You were good at it once before, weren't you, as a U.S. Marshal?" Jack froze. The name Cole was common enough. But the title? No one in Harmony Gulch knew about that. "You seem surprised," Cain continued, his voice laced with a cold amusement. "Did you really think you could bury a man like Jack Cole, the Lion of Laramie, under the dust of a simple ranch hand?" He reached into the pocket of his tailored coat. It wasn't a gun he pulled out. It was a silver locket identical to Jack's. He clicked it open. "I believe you have one just like this," Cain said, holding it out. "A keepsake. A reminder of what you've lost." Jack's eyes were locked on the locket, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. "Of course," Cain added, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "the portrait inside mine is different." He tilted it so Jack could see. It wasn't a woman and child. It was a formal tintype portrait of two young men, and their arms slung around each other's shoulders, their faces serious, but full of youthful bravado. Jack recognized one of them instantly. The sharp jaw, the defiant eyes. It was Elias Walton, the young outlaw. He'd arrested the one whose gang had destroyed his family. The other man was a younger, less polished version of Silas Cain. "My brother Cain," said his voice now stripped of all pretense, leaving only a core of pure, distilled hatred. "You don't remember his name, do you, Marshal? You arrested so many. But I remember yours. I've been remembering it every day for 5 years." The pieces crashed into place in Jack's mind with sickening force. The robbery, the murder, the ranch, the psychological torment of Grace. It was all for him. Cain hadn't stumbled upon him by accident. He had hunted him down. This was never about money or land, Cain hissed, his composure finally cracking to reveal the obsessive fury beneath. This has always been about justice. An eye for an eye, a family for a family. I've watched you wither in your grief. And then I watched you start to heal. I saw you look at that woman, that child. I saw you start to build something new. And I decided that before I kill you, I'm going to let you watch it all burn again. He snapped the locket shut, the sound like a gunshot in the silent night. Sleep well, Marshall. The ghosts are coming for you. Cain turned and melted back into the darkness, leaving Jack standing alone under the cold, indifferent stars, the full, horrifying weight of his past crashing down upon him. He wasn't just fighting for Grace and Lily anymore. He was fighting a war he didn't even know had been declared, a war born from a single act of justice that had festered into a relentless, patient, and all-consuming revenge. The world tilted on its axis. The ground beneath Jack's feet, once solid earth, now felt like a trapped door waiting to spring. Cain's revelation echoed in the silence of the night, a poison that seeped into every corner of Jack's carefully constructed peace. Every polite nod from Cain in town, every seemingly random act of malice toward Grace, it was all a meticulously choreographed performance, and Jack had been its unwitting audience. He returned to the barn, the scent of hay and horses, doing nothing to calm the storm raging inside him. He found Grace asleep in a chair by the hearth, a mending basket in her lap waiting for him. Lily was asleep in her newly built crib nearby. The domestic tranquility of the scene was a brutal counterpoint to the ugliness of Cain's threat. He was a lightning rod, and he had drawn the storm directly to this house, to this woman and child, who had offered him a glimpse of a life he thought was lost to him forever. He had to leave. He had to draw Cain away from them. The next morning, the town of Harmony Gulch turned on him. Sheriff Miller, a man whose spine was made of jelly, and whose loyalties were for sale to the highest bidder, rode out to Grace's property with 2 freshly deputized men, both of them on Cain's payroll. Jack Cole Miller announced, puffing out his chest. "Got a warrant for your arrest." "On what charge?" Jack asked, his voice flat. He was standing on the porch, a cup of coffee in his hand, Grace watching from the doorway behind him. "Cattle rustling," Miller said, waving a piece of paper. "Old Man Hemlock's prize bull went missing last night. Found its hide branded with your mark tossed in a ravine over on Cain's property." It was a clumsy, obvious frame-up, but in a town already swayed by Cain's money and charm, it was enough. "That's a lie," Grace said, her voice sharp and clear. "He was here all night." Miller sneered. "And I suppose you're an impartial witness, ma'am, a man sharing your roof." Jack placed a hand on Grace's arm, a silent signal to stand down. Arguing was pointless. This wasn't about the law. It was about Cain tightening the noose. "I'll come along peacefully, Sheriff," Jack said, placing his cup on the railing. No need for trouble. He expected them to take him to the town jail. He was wrong. They led him not toward town, but up into the hills toward Cain's ranch. The pretense of justice was over. This was an abduction. As they rode, one of the deputies, a brutish man named Cletus, grinned. "Mr. Cain is real eager to have a word with you, Marshal." Jack's mind raced. He had to escape, not just for his own sake, but for Grace's. Cain wouldn't stop with him. As long as he was alive, Grace and Lily were leverage. His opportunity came at a narrow pass where the trail wound along the edge of a steep, wooded canyon. He had been studying the terrain, the way the horses picked their way over the loose shale. He waited for the moment when Miller was looking ahead, and the 2 deputies were momentarily distracted by a rattlesnake sunning itself on a rock. In one fluid motion, Jack kicked his feet free of the stirrups, spun in the saddle, and launched himself at the deputy riding behind him. The man grunted in surprise as Jack's full weight slammed into him, knocking them both from the horse. They tumbled onto the rocky trail, a tangle of limbs. Jack was up first. He landed a punch to the man's jaw that sent him sprawling, stunned. The other deputy, Cletus, was already drawing his pistol. But Jack was faster. He grabbed the reins of the first deputy's horse, vaulted into the saddle, and spurred the animal hard, not back down the trail, but straight off the path and down the treacherous, scree-covered slope into the canyon below. Shots rang out behind him, bullets whizzing past his head, kicking up spurts of rock and dirt. The horse screamed, half sliding, half falling down the incline. Jack held on, using his weight to guide their desperate descent branches, whipping at his face, tearing at his clothes. They hit the canyon floor with a bone-jarring impact. The horse stumbled but found its footing. Without looking back, Jack urged it on, disappearing into the thick pine and aspen forest that choked the canyon bottom. He was a fugitive. Cain had successfully turned the law against him, isolating him completely. But Cain had made a crucial miscalculation. He had forgotten who Jack Cole used to be. The rancher was a disguise. The marshal was the reality. And a marshal knew how to survive. He knew how to hunt. For days, he lived in the wilderness he knew as well as the back of his hand. He doubled back, using streams to hide his tracks, laying false trails that led Cain's men on fruitless chases. From the high ridges, he watched them studying their patterns, their numbers, their incompetence. They were hired guns, not trackers. But he was cut off from Grace. He had no way of knowing if she was safe, if Cain had already made his next move. The worry was a constant gnawing ache in his gut. He had to get a message to her, had to find a way to end this. He found his chance in the form of the old sheep herder he had met before. He found the man's camp, and after assuring the grizzled prospector he wasn't a ghost, entrusted him with a message for Grace. A simple drawing on a piece of bark, a bird with a broken wing, a symbol they had once spoken of next to a crude map of an old, abandoned mining town deep in the Badlands called Whisperwind Canyon. It was a message of desperation, a plea for her to get away to meet him there, if she could escape. What he didn't know was that Cain was one step ahead. His men had intercepted the sheepherder. Cain now knew Jack's location, and he had a better idea. Instead of just killing Jack, he would make Jack come to him. He sent a rider to Grace's ranch. The message was simple and brutal. Cain had her daughter. If she ever wanted to see Lily again, she would come to Whisperwind Canyon, alone. Jack, waiting in the desolate ghost town, knew nothing of this. He only knew that the waiting was becoming unbearable. He was a man on the run, a man with a price on his head, and the woman he had come to love was caught in the crossfire. He had tried to protect her by leaving, but all he had done was leave her exposed. The wind was a living thing in Whisperwind Canyon. It moaned through the skeletal remains of the abandoned mining town, kicking up curtains of sand that stung the eyes and scoured the weathered wood of the derelict buildings. The sky overhead was a bruised, angry purple, the clouds churning as a massive sandstorm gathered on the horizon. It was a place where things came to die, and Jack Cole felt its grim welcome deep in his bones. He had been waiting for 2 days, his hope dwindling with each passing hour. He'd seen the riders in the distance, Cain's men forming a loose perimeter around the canyon, trapping him. The old sheepherder's message had been intercepted. It wasn't a rendezvous. It was an ambush. He was a fool. Then he saw her, a lone figure on horseback riding slowly up the canyon's main dust-choked street. Grace. Her face was a pale, determined mask. Jack's heart leaped with a desperate, terrible relief, which immediately curdled into ice-cold dread. She shouldn't be here. She was walking into the heart of the trap. He was about to call out to her to warn her, when Silas Cain stepped out from the shadows, of the crumbling assay office. He was holding Lily in his arms. The child wasn't crying. She was looking around with a wide-eyed curiosity, utterly unaware of the danger she was in. A family reunion. Kane called out his voice, carrying easily on the rising wind. How touching. Grace dismounted, her movements stiff. Let her go, Silas. All in good time, my dear, Kane said, stroking Lily's hair. First, our guest of honor must show himself. Come out, Marshal. The performance is about to begin. Jack stepped out from behind the old livery stable, his colt in his hand, his face grim. This is between you and me, Kane. Let them go. Kane laughed, a dry, humorless sound. Oh, it has always been between you and me. But they are the grand finale. They are the part of you that I get to burn. He handed Lily to one of his men, a hulking brute named Cletus. Take the child. Keep the mother here. If Cole so much as twitches, you know what to do. The stage was set. The street was the arena. The audience was a half-dozen hired guns positioned on rooftops and in doorways. Grace stood frozen, a pawn in a game she couldn't comprehend, her eyes pleading with Jack. You wanted a showdown, Kane. Jack said, his voice low and steady despite the tremor of rage he felt. You've got it. The wind howled, whipping sand into their faces. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, turning the dust to mud. Before we conclude our business, Kane said, drawing his own pistol, a silver-inlaid Remington, I want you to know the full truth of your sin. You seem to be laboring under the delusion that my brother's death was a tragic accident in the line of your noble duty. He drew on me, Jack said, his teeth gritted. He did, Kane conceded. After you had beaten him, after you had cornered him in that stable. He was a boy marshal, scared and bleeding. He wanted to surrender. I have the letter he wrote me the night before he was going to turn himself in. But you were angry that day, weren't you? You'd lost one of your own men in the chase. You didn't want justice. You wanted blood. You goaded him. You pushed him until he had no choice but to draw just so you could kill him under the color of law. The words struck Jack with the force of a physical blow because they were true. He remembered that day. The fury, the grief for his fallen deputy, the blind rage that had guided his hand. He had wanted the boy to draw. He had needed it. In that moment that the line between lawman and executioner had blurred into nothing. That is the man you are. A cold Kane spat the storm in his eyes, mirroring the one in the sky. A fraud, hiding behind a badge and a broken heart. You destroy everything you touch. The revelation settled in Jack's soul, a truth he had long buried. He wasn't just a victim of circumstance. He was a man whose own failings, whose own rage had set this entire tragedy in motion. He was culpable. But looking at Grace, at the terror and love warring in her eyes, he knew this was no longer about his past. It was about her future. He couldn't erase his sins, but he could pay for them by saving her. The fight was not for vengeance. It was for redemption. The world exploded into action. Kane fired first. Jack dove, rolling behind a water trough as the bullet splintered the wood where his head had been. He came up firing not at Kane, but at the sniper on the roof of the saloon. The man cried out and tumbled into the street. Chaos erupted. Kane's men opened fire. Jack moved with a deadly grace, a ghost in the swirling sand and rain. He used the decaying town as his shield, his shots precise, economical. He wasn't the raging lawman from Kane's story. He was cold-focused, every bullet, a calculated move, in a lethal chess match. He took out another gunman in a window, a third, as the man tried to flank him. He saw Grace. In the midst of the gunfire, she wasn't cowering. She was running, dodging, heading for Cletus, who was fumbling with the frightened, crying Lily. Grace launched herself at the big man, clawing at his face, giving Jack the opening he needed. He fired the bullet, catching Cletus in the shoulder. The man roared in pain, dropping Lily. Grace scooped her daughter up and scrambled for the cover of the assayer's office. They were safe for now. It was just him and Kane. They faced each other in the middle of the street, the storm now raging around them. The wind ripped at their clothes, and the rain fell in blinding sheets. You see, Kane screamed over the wind. It all turns to ash around you. He charged, firing wildly. Jack stood his ground, his aim steady. He fired once. The bullet struck the gun from Kane's hand. He fired again. The second shot hit Kane squarely in the chest. Silas Kane staggered back, a look of profound surprise on his face. He looked down at the blossoming red stain on his white shirt, then back at Jack. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a wet, gurgling sound came out. He crumpled to the muddy ground, his quest for revenge ending not with a bang, but with a final shuddering sigh. The remaining gunmen, seeing their leader fall, melted away into the storm. Silence descended, broken only by the howling wind and the patter of rain. Jack walked slowly toward Kane's body. He knelt not out of respect, but to confirm the end. He closed the dead man's staring eyes. Grace ran to him. Then Lily clutched tightly in her arms. She threw her free arm around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder, her sobs lost in the storm. Jack wrapped his arms around her, and the child holding on as if they were the only solid things in a world that had dissolved into chaos. He was wounded, bleeding from a graze on his arm, exhausted and weighed down by the heavy truth of his own past. But in his arms, he held the fragile, precious promise of a future. He had won, but the victory tasted of ash and rain. The sandstorm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world washed clean and unnervingly quiet. In the pale, watery light of dawn, Whisper Wind Canyon was a graveyard of fresh mud and old ghosts. Jack, Grace, and Lily rode out of it, leaving Silas Kane and his men to the judgment of the elements. They returned to Harmony Gulch not as fugitives, but as survivors. The story pieced together from a confession by the wounded Cletus, whom Jack had tied to his saddle rather than leave to die, and a strong box full of Kane's incriminating letters found at his ranch spread through the town like wildfire. Jack Cole was no rustler. He was the man who had single-handedly dismantled a criminal enterprise that had been slowly strangling their valley. The town that had scorned him now looked upon him with a mixture of awe and sheepish gratitude. Sheriff Miller quietly resigned, packed his bags, and was gone by noon. Jack was exonerated, but he felt no triumph. The truth of Kane's final words had settled deep within him. He was no simple hero. He was a man who had carried a seed of darkness within him, a darkness that had cost him his first family and nearly his second. The days that followed were quiet and laced with a gentle melancholy. Jack's arm healed the physical wound, closing far more easily than the ones within. He and Grace moved through their days with a new sober understanding of one another. The terrors they had faced had stripped away all pretense, leaving only a raw, honest connection. They spoke little of the showdown in the canyon, but it was always there, a shared memory that bound them together more tightly than any vow. Grace watched him, saw the new weight he carried in his shoulders, the way he would stare into the distance, lost in a past she could only guess at. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of orange and rose, she finally broke the silence. "It wasn't your fault, Jack," she said softly. He didn't look at her. Some of it was. It was the first time he had admitted it aloud. The confession was quiet, but it was a release. She reached out and placed her hand over his. Her touch was warm, steady. "The man I know," she said, her voice firm, "is the one who saved my child from a charging bull. The one who built her a crib with his own hands. the one who faced down a half-dozen guns to protect us. The past doesn't get to claim that man. I won't let it. He finally turned to look at her, and in her clear, unwavering gaze, he saw not judgment, but acceptance. He saw a love that was strong enough to encompass his flaws, his grief, and his guilt. He saw home. Weeks later, life had found a new, peaceful rhythm. Spring had arrived in the high country, blanketing the valley in a vibrant carpet of green grass and wildflowers. The ranch was no longer just his or hers. It was theirs. A true home filled with the sounds of Lily's laughter as she took her first wobbly steps on the porch, the scent of Grace's baking, and the steady, reassuring presence of Jack's quiet strength. One bright, clear morning, Jack saddled his horse. He didn't tell Grace where he was going, but she knew. She watched him from the doorway, Lily balanced on her hip, and simply nodded a silent blessing for the journey he had to make alone. He rode for hours up into the high meadows, to a place marked by two simple wooden crosses under the shade of a towering ponderosa pine. The air here was thin and sweet with the scent of sap. He dismounted and walked to the graves of his wife Sarah and his daughter, the first Lily. For a long time, he just stood there, the silence of the mountain, his only companion. He spoke to them, not in grand speeches, but in quiet, broken phrases, telling them everything. He told them about Cain, about the revenge, about the ugly truth of his own anger. And then he told them about Grace, and about the little girl who shared their Lily's name, and had somehow taught his heart to beat again. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small silver locket, its surface worn smooth by years of touch. He clicked it open one last time, gazing at the faded portraits of the family he had lost. They were not ghosts to be feared, but memories to be honored. He had carried his grief like a shield for 5 years, but it had become a cage. With a final gentle touch of his thumb across their images, he closed the locket. He dug a small hole in the earth at the base of the crosses between his wife and his child. He placed the locket inside a symbolic act of release. He was not burying his love for them, but his guilt. He was letting go of the past's suffocating grip, making room for a new future. As he covered the locket with earth, a sense of peace settled over him, profound and complete. The surprise wasn't in a grand revelation, but in the quiet acceptance that followed. He was no longer a man defined by what he had lost. He was a man defined by what he was choosing to build. He mounted his horse and turned back toward the valley below. From this high vantage point, he could see his ranch, a small, hopeful patch of life, nestled in the vast, wild beauty of the landscape. He could see a plume of smoke rising from the chimney, a signal fire calling him home. He was no longer running from his past, but had built a new life upon its foundations, a life of healing loyalty and love. He spurred his horse forward, his heart for the first time in a very long time, feeling not broken, but whole.